You are listening to the Foreign Policy Focus podcast.
We cannot wait for the final proof. The smoking gun could come in the form of a mushroom cloud.
Haven't you driven enough people from their homes already? Bulldoze their villages, seize their property under laws they had no part in making.
Now working in Libya with friends and allies, we've demonstrated what collective action can achieve in the 21st century.
Now the host of the show, Kyle Ansel.
This is episode 316 of the Foreign Policy Focus podcast. I'm bringing Adam Graham on the show today to discuss a recent article that appeared at the Libertarian Institute titled Remember the Maine. The article was published on the anniversary, I believe, of the sinking of the Maine, so we're going to be a couple weeks behind that by the time the episode aired, but it was a great article. Actually, earlier this week, Scott Horton mentioned it on the show, saying it was a pretty good article. I really enjoyed it, and I think it has a lot of relevance today with, regime change and how the U.S. ends up getting into interventions. So, Adam, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Kyle. It's a pleasure to finally be on. I know we've known each other for quite a while and tried to find a good reason to talk together here. So it's great to be here at the debut on the podcast and with an article I'm pretty proud of. So
yeah, I mean, we met on Facebook several years ago, but the past year or so, you've been the other admin in the Facebook group Foreign Policy Focus, and probably actually a little bit more active than me in there. So I really appreciate that. And you've been doing some great writing at the Libertarian Institute as well as on your blog, No King But Christ. And you're putting out some YouTube videos under the channel is the same name, right? No King But Christ.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
So make sure to check out all of his work. And of course, Libertarian Institute is where you can find the show and my daily news roundup as well. So it's a great place to, find everything we're talking about today. And I will link to Adam's article in the show notes page. I think your article does a good job of not just kind of discussing like the Maine and the controversy and afterwards, but really what was happening leading up to the explosion and the sinking of the Maine in Cuba. So can you go over, first of all, I guess, let's just start as what was actually happening in Cuba leading up to the sinking of the Maine?
Yeah, so, it's not one of those kind of notorious anniversaries or anything, but February 15th, so about a week ago at the time of this recording, was kind of the, nominal anniversary of the Maine. And kind of goes down in history as one of those turning point, events like the Lusitania or you look at the World Trade Center bombing or that sort of thing. These events that, even though they're happening within the history as a whole, really kind of change the narrative and change the direction going forward. But the situation was really set a lot earlier than that. If you recall, kind of at the last decade of the 19th century, we have a number. Anytime you ever read history about the Maine, they'll usually point out some of the key other cultural things that are going on at the time. Cuba had been going through for the past couple of decades leading up to the kind of mid 1890s a couple independence movements. So at the time, Spain had a colonial holding there. As we recall, Florida and a lot of the western coast of the United States were Spanish, colonized areas at the time. So this was kind of one of those last remaining holdouts of colonial Spain, Cuba, and I believe Puerto Rico and the Philippines. And so, Cuba, very close proximity to America. And so there was a sort of feeling amongst Americans, as you could imagine, of not really liking, Spanish influence in Cuba, especially when the people there had been fighting for their independence. It's kind of a common cultural, sentiment there between Americans looking for independence from a colonial power and Cuba doing the same. But those independence movements hadn't really taken on, and it had been about 15 years, I believe, before since the last attempt. But there were some, I mentioned Jose Marti here in the piece as well. I believe they had actually been previous exiles from Cuba at the end of the last independence movement in New York, I believe, kind of working their way and working into trying again. And so about the mid 1890s, that movement begins again. And it coincides with a number of other things that are happening at the end of the 19th century that are usually brought up and become kind of part of that cultural milieu and zeitgeist, the spirit of the age that goes on there. One is obviously Cuba happening there. Another is, I believe, in the earlier 1890s, around when Grover Cleveland is president, there's a recession that happens there. And from a libertarian perspective, I think Cleveland kind of handles that well. But anytime we're going through recession and an economic downturn, domestically, citizens kind of get a little antsy. And there's some industrial, glut that's happening there. Trade is down a little bit, but production is up. And so the market industry is looking for extra market opportunities. And at the same time, there are people within, the state and military apparatus who are trying to push for, expansion of some sort. So you get, I mentioned, here, I have to remember, Mahan, I believe, the, head of the Naval War College here, is kind of publishing a work and getting into, these politically connected circles. People like, Henry Cabot Lodge is a big figure at the time. Teddy Roosevelt, obviously, a pretty, infamous figure, is also in those kind of, circles, pushing for greater naval expansion, especially in tying into, being able to expand American trade into global markets. And so while we generally, would be interested in that sort of thing from a libertarian perspective, it's obviously not, apparent why that would need to be, some sort of, naval state sort of, expansion. But obviously the Naval War College head looking for naval expansion, and trade into other markets. And Cuba, obviously, being a place where, kind of American industry had done some investment, over time, had quite a sizable investment there. And so naturally, we've got kind of a coalescence of different influences that are all kind of, moving toward maybe a desired end, all for their own reasons, but, working working, together, basically looking, wanting some of the same ends, but not always, very good means. So that's happening at the time, and there's a bit of influence and desire at the political level and the popular level, to do something about Cuba. But so far, America had been kind of, good at, staying, out of it. But as, William McKinley comes in the latter, portion of the 1890s from a little less interventionist Cleveland, he's a little bit politically tied into the sort of people who are really pushing for this. And so, we start to see that kind of those political interests begin to find an outlet, find an opportunity here. And Cuba, a new, independence movement breaking out here is exactly kind of what they need to do, what we're looking for, to push for that. So.
All right. So I guess here's a good question. And, I think somewhat relevant to what we have going on today is, we have the Maine somehow ends up in the port of Havana, right? And so, what the hell was it doing there?
Yeah. I think you get a couple different, points of view. And as I point out here, even without any statements or anything like that, there's only a certain number of reasons why a U.S. warship should be in a foreign port. So you'll hear it, mentioned in some articles that, the presence of the Maine, kind of lets the conflict settle down a little bit. Things, cool down a bit between Spain and the rebels. You could kind of see that as maybe a positive, effect or like a good reason for putting for U.S. intervention of some sort. But I'm not exactly sure what the reaction should have been. It makes sense to me, that neither Spain nor the independence, rebels, would at the time wanted the U.S. to intervene. They had put it there, basically, either to show a sort of, a show of force or a presence there to say, hey, we're going to be involved in this in some way or another. So, this is kind of the first foot in the door. And at the worst end, and you can certainly see this kind of, hinted at through the correspondence between people like media men like William Randolph Hearst and Cabot Lodge and Teddy Roosevelt as a way to almost kind of draw attention and a focal point, a presence there in order to get to be involved, more directly in the conflict. So I haven't seen any real definitive reason why it's there, but we see this all the time in more recent times, right? We have maybe there will be I recall U.S. patrols off the territorial waters of Iran, and we had that kind of issue. I think it's a year or more now. Where those sailors had been captured and held by Iran for a while. We see, aircraft carriers getting sent to the Persian Gulf or off the coast of the Mediterranean or here and there, basically to show a presence and that the U.S. is party to whatever's going on there. And so even if they're not directly fighting, they're made a presence there. But as I call in the piece, you can see why politicians would do that in a sense of kind of, staking a claim and putting themselves there as a presence to be involved. But, effectively what you're doing is using these soldiers' lives as almost bargaining chips or as a pawn, to involve yourself in a military way, not really give them any direct thing to do, but just be there. And so at best, they're, a power play. At worst, they are putting these people, these soldiers in the line of fire in harm's way for a political, purpose and not directly as some sort of U.S. defense. Because obviously the what's going on in Cuba here, apart from a very vague, national interest sort of scenario, is not in any way posing any direct threat to the U.S. And so the presence of a ship here is pretty suspicious, I would think, even if the political means had some sort of best interest at heart. Certainly something that you or I would look pretty poorly at, and as we eventually saw, did eventually incite a lot of nasty effects, right?
Yeah, well, there's a couple places. I would also point to Syria with what the U.S. troops have done there to, basically drive Humvees around with big American flags on them in between the Turkish-backed Al-Qaeda fighters and the U.S.-backed Kurdish fighters there along the Euphrates River and outside of Manbij. But also, somewhere I see a lot of, one of the reasons that I think this, Maine story is important is to look at what the U.S. is doing today, sailing ships either around the Chinese claimed waters in the South China Sea or through the Taiwan Strait. In recent years, we've seen times where those ships have been confronted with Chinese ships. And so imagine that if a U.S. ship ends up either running aground or, running into one of these Chinese ships, what's going to happen? And I guess this is where we should go with your story on the Maine here is, I guess, first of all, what happened as far as how did it get sunk? But then what was the narrative spun off of that and what was the results of that?
Sure. Yeah. I reckon I kind of view it as, say you walked into a bar and there's a fight going on, right? Now you could be there. You might even be a big guy. And you might have good intentions of being there, but you shouldn't be surprised if you get punched, because there's something going on there. You're submitting your presence there. It's not as though it's a clear, easily, managed situation between two sides that are in conflict that somehow you're not going to suffer some sort of damage or loss. So again, February 15th, I believe it was pretty late in the evening. The Maine does explode. Ended up killing, I see different numbers, but a lot of times it's around 260 men. As I understand it, there were, it certainly was not all the people on board. You've got, kind of a crew quarters that were near the boiler kind of end of the ship and crew quarters at the other end. The crew quarters near the boiler are where, you see a huge loss of life. Again, 250, 260-ish soldiers, and the other side is much less impacted. And pretty early on, you start to see, and I have a scan there of, I did some searching for like newspaper headlines and that sort of thing. I found a couple here and even included one in the piece of, it seemed pretty early on that the press ran with a story that the Spanish were involved somehow. You do have an inquiry, of course, that happens, kind of like a lot of, other conflicts. They'll have some sort of government appointed inquiry into it. That inquiry found that, at the time at least, that it was due to some external explosion. And apparently, when that came out, it even put, more fuel under that fire to say, oh, it must be the Spanish because it, wasn't some mistake or something. Now it's interesting to note, and I don't know if was relevant for the piece at the time, but, the Spanish actually assisted really early on in rescuing a number of the soldiers who were needing rescuing there, in the water or in need of assistance. So helped to rally people to actually save the soldiers that had not already perished in the ship. And so that gives you some evidence again to say, to wonder why we should maybe be critical of that knee-jerk reaction to Spanish, that the Spanish would have been directly involved. I point out in the piece, this looks to me, of course, like a lot of other similar reactions to an explosion or an incident like this, right? We have to ask ourselves why, out of the realm of possibilities, whether it being a Spanish attack, a rebel attack, or some sort of accident, why would any of those scenarios be more likely? And it seems to me, when you're in a situation where the Spanish would not want you to intervene, the rebels at the time actually did not want the U.S. to intervene either. You had direct statements from a lot of the rebel leaders to not look for the U.S. or outside forces to come and intervene on their behalf. Neither side wants you to intervene. So what reason do they have to incite this sort of incident? That sort of logic and thinking through why someone should be blamed or why it makes sense for them to do such a thing seems to be absent in a lot of these cases. And I bring out in the piece and is real relevant to us. My mind goes to the chemical attacks in Syria. I believe 3 or 4 of them at the present time. Hopefully, God forbid, there be any more. But the knee-jerk reaction is, Assad. Assad is the villain. He's the bad guy. Syria is the bad guy. It must be Assad. Where when you think the situation through, Assad has very little, if any, reason to purposefully do such a thing when he and many of the, at least some of the players in Syria don't want the U.S. there to begin with. They don't want to draw attention, and they have the support of the populace. So why would they do such a thing? But this sort of reasoning doesn't seem to play itself out in the press, even though there may be people, at the time, and there were, shortly following the incident, government officials, of course, with no real power and no real platform, giving the warnings to, try to say we shouldn't draw any conclusions from this. We shouldn't, we should be very lax to put blame out there until we've really, looked through the evidence. But of course, those are not hardly ever taken. They don't ever really make it out to the popular press or the popular opinion. So again, the blame seems to be real quick, real fast after the incident, but it doesn't really play out either logically or eventually in any of the inquiries, as we as I mentioned here and as I've read about. There are a number of different conclusions as to why it occurred. It's actually quite likely that it was an internal explosion, actually, either due to some boiler, combustion, or there was I believe a number of munitions that were near the boiler, so you kind of maybe had an internal fire and then an explosion due to that. But no matter what, the reason, it actually doesn't seem like any of the possible explanations really play into some overt Spanish attack. And yet that's obviously where, war eventually led. So.
Right. Well, I guess now let's go on to talk about, I remember my vocabulary word from high school, history class, yellow journalism, and basically, I guess, how it was a media frenzy that really helped rally us into war, using this as the false pretense, just like as you're saying with Syria or, in any other case where, I guess in Vietnam where you had an actual incident versus Iraq where they, just make up a bunch of fake ones. But either way, the media is the one that rallies the public and helps lies us into war.
Yeah. I recall reading, Rothbard when he talks about the intellectual class and how they need the state, how they play into supporting each other. And I think that certainly, if not directly applies to the press, it certainly has a lot of the similar implications for the press, because it makes sense that the state wants a particular perception, right? The political class wants a particular viewpoint, and especially if they can control that viewpoint, all the better. And the press will generally want to, increase their circulation or their viewership or, their overall popularity and revenue. So, obviously when you see this triumvirate of kind of politically connected press and different, people within the political class, so that kind of triumvirate there is loosely, Teddy Roosevelt and Henry Cabot Lodge and William Randolph Hearst. We see Hearst and many of the similar papers of his, rallying this war cry, and you get the impression that there's some sort of collusion there, or maybe some, certainly they have again beneficial, separate but beneficial interests at heart, and it's getting them a lot of press. So I believe it was quoted here that Hearst's paper, the New York Journal, had doubled its circulation, and there seems to be a sort of human interest in wanting to read about, these sorts of disasters and being drawn to, injustice and conflict and these things. And so saying that, peace is coming around and things are winding down and you're trying to find a peaceful, resolution to things, that doesn't sell as many newspapers. So, certainly the motivation here is pretty well aligned between the political class and the press, and this is what you see in this yellow journalism. There doesn't seem to be, at least not in the headlines and the conclusions that are drawn, a lot of well-reasoned sort of conclusions and reporting. As this is no different than we typically see in mainstream media. Naturally, you and I, traffic in circles that where you get kind of more investigative, independent journalism. You get a lot of different conclusions, but this is not the narrative that takes hold, right? It's not the one that's popular or profitable or anything. So you get a number of papers, both before and after the event, pushing for either shedding real negative light on Spanish occupation or General Weyler, as you see kind of being villainized early on, and then afterwards of continuing to push for intervention in Cuba, but even after, which is not covered in the piece a ton, but what you see afterwards, after the Cubans do win their independence, a push by the press that they can't have independence, that they can't really handle independence on their own. They need continued U.S. involvement or control in order to properly govern themselves. And so I just see them dropping the ball in every way here, and it really just shows you how this hasn't changed, at least not in the 20th century, right? This sort of tendency for the press to sensationalize these sorts of events for their own gain without a lot of thought put into it, or kind of a skepticism, and ultimately the same sort of ends that we come to here, not principled. And certainly, in my opinion, not actually very American, at least from a kind of a founding standpoint or an old guard conservative sort of libertarian standpoint. So
I guess let's bring this to today, when we have accumulated a bunch of aid on the border with Venezuela. Now, most of that's in Colombia, although I think the Brazilians are stacking some aid on the border as well. And while this is, I guess, somewhat different than a warship, even the groups like the Red Cross have come out and said that, they kind of denounce this aid as, being obviously having political motives and incentives. And when you give out aid with political motives and incentives, then it creates all kinds of problems. And so it seems to me that, if the U.S. is going to let opposition leaders hop in some trucks and try to drive them across the border with Venezuela, when the Venezuelan government is, saying that you can't cross our border, this is a sovereign border, we're not going to allow you in, then, what happens? And so if it ends up getting violent, then I think we'll see a situation like we did with the Maine, where everybody is just kind of focusing on, oh my God, how could they do this? How could this happen? And as you say, not looking at anything in the broader context and looking to have a more level-headed reaction to it. It's going to be the biggest reaction possible. Oh, this is the most tragic thing that ever happened. More aid workers died today than blah, blah, blah. And that'll be all the focus. So I don't know if you have anything to say about that.
Yeah, I mean, Venezuela was definitely in my mind as I was going back and researching this a little bit. I mean, you have a case, not an obvious colonial case, but nowadays, post Cold War, we have this sort of the same sort of reaction, I think, against socialism or communism as we previously did to colonialism. And so you see a lot of the same, at the time it was kind of called, Cuba Libre, is this freedom movement for Cuba, and they really, really wanted it, but at the same time didn't really think that they could that they could manage it completely on their own. So that sort of push for playing up the injustice of the Venezuelans, either in this case kind of suffering under real collapsing socialism, or the prospect at a greater chance of democracy. I think you see a lot of similarity there between, what DC would say they want for Cuba as in what they want for Venezuela. But again, when you look at the after effects of all these cases, and these two are not the only case, obviously, where we push for, it's played up as though, the object of intervention is, the goal is greater democracy or greater freedom. If the result from just any of these past interventions were to actually end up, giving people independence, granting them self-government, and then kind of leaving them alone to figure it out and do what's in their best interests, had actually had a history of happening, then you might have a reason to actually support this sort of action, right? But we just never see that to be the case. And Cuba is definitely, in this turn of the 20th century, is no exception here. We obviously know what happened to Cuba later on, as they fell, more into socialism, but they were not given their independence eventually after they had won it. The U.S. continued to dictate how they would rule themselves. They did the same thing in the Philippines. And so I just see no reason to believe, at least from a state perspective, that the U.S. will actually do what is in the best interests of the Venezuelans. It might be in better interest than Chavez or Maduro, but ultimately, there are other motives in play here, and the unseen in these cases. We talk about it in economics a lot, the seen and the unseen. There is a seen and unseen when it comes to foreign policy too. It's no exception. And the seen looks very simple and black and white. The unseen is exactly what people like me and you, the exact reason why we do what we do, right? Because the unseen, the unheard of, these are really the issues at play here. And so if we're going to be consistent, there's just no reason to think that the U.S. actually has pure motives in this case, because they have a history of impure motives in the past. And so we can certainly be in favor for Venezuela in, providing individual aid, anything at the individual or private level, much more likely to succeed, much more likely to not introduce these unseen things. But anytime a state actor is looking to get in there, they're probably not wrong that even though it's aid, there usually are strings attached, when it comes to anything the state does. So.
Right. Well, I guess, the reason this is so important is just to show that there's a history of this happening where the U.S. Gets involved in something, and at first is seemingly to keep the peace or to provide aid or to help the people, to restore democracy. But every time it ends up being creating a worse situation. And while on the show, I typically talk about Libya, Syria, Yemen, Afghanistan, Pakistan, etc. Talking about the Maine and Latin America and now what's happening in Venezuela are all very important events. And I think when you understand it in the kind of this has historically been happening, it's much easier to understand why there's a reason to oppose kind of what's going on right now in Venezuela and thinking that it might not be a great thing and we might want to reject it. So, Adam, thank you so much for your great work. I'll get you back on the show again as you keep writing more. I'm enjoying the No King But Christ blog and, of course, all of your insightful commentary in the private Facebook group. So is there anything else you want to send people to? I guess make sure you go to his YouTube channel and subscribe to it. I know with YouTube, getting more subscribers is very important to unlocking different features and stuff like that. But is there anything else, Adam?
No, that'd be great. I mean, I'd be honored if anyone wanted to check out the writing on the blog. Again, I submit things to Libertarian Institute from time to time if it's relevant there. So, if you're interested in libertarianism, I think, obviously No King But Christ, we come at things kind of from a Christian worldview, but I think a lot of the content we have there is equally applicable for most libertarians. So if you're interested in that, check that out. If you want to hang out with us and talk directly with us, you go to Foreign Policy Focus. It's a nice group. We have really elevated discussion there. There's no crazy internet culture there or anything. It's really useful. And no, it's been great, Kyle. I can't wait to be on again.
All right. Thanks, Adam.
Thanks.